The first time I really noticed her, I wasn't even supposed to be paying attention. I had gone over to my friend's house to drop off some textbooks I had borrowed, expecting the usual cluttered chaos of teenagers' room, the smell of laundry detergent and old pizza. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, everything shifted. She was there, his mom, moving with a quiet, graceful authority that somehow made the mundane task of preparing tea feel effortless. I didn't notice it at first, just the way her hands worked, slender fingers wrapping around a kettle, the gentle press of her palms against the counter as she leaned slightly forward. There was a subtle strength in her gestures, a kind of unspoken confidence that made the air in the room feel warmer, somehow heavier, in a good way. "Hey," she said casually, glancing up at me with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, though it made them sparkle. She studied my hands for a moment and then, almost teasingly, remarked, "Your hands look strong. Prove it." It was so offhand that I almost laughed. Almost, but the way her gaze lingered on me made my chest tighten. There was a light teasing under her words. Yes, but also something else, an unspoken curiosity, maybe even a challenge. I felt my own hands twitch instinctively, like they had a role to play I hadn't anticipated. The kitchen smelled faintly of vanilla and something earthy, like fresh herbs, and the sunlight coming through the window fell in golden strips across the floor, catching on her hair in a way that made it glow. I couldn't decide whether I was noticing her for the first time or noticing her properly. There was a warmth in her presence, a quiet energy that made the walls of the room feel smaller and more intimate than they should have been. I cleared my throat, suddenly self-conscious of how ordinary my movements must seem compared to hers. My friend's mom, with her poised composure, was someone who clearly lived with intention, while I felt like a boy stumbling through the world. And yet, there was something in the way she looked at me, something that made the gap in our ages feel irrelevant for a heartbeat. She handed me a small bag of flour as if it were nothing, but her fingers brushed mine ever so slightly, just a fleeting contact but enough to make my pulse spike. I noticed the subtle curve of her smile, the way her eyes softened as she nodded encouragingly, and a small, nervous warmth spread across my face. By the time I left the kitchen, I knew that nothing would feel quite ordinary the next time I came over. That one casual comment, "Prove it," had lodged itself in my thoughts, playful yet strange, a tiny seed of curiosity and anticipation I didn't know how to name. For the first time, I realized I was paying attention to her in a way I hadn't expected, and that maybe, just maybe, she had noticed me too. From that day on, every glance, every touch, every word between us would carry a quiet weight, a slow-building tension that neither of us could, or wanted to, ignore. A few days later, I found myself back at my friend's house, this time not just as a visitor, but as an impromptu helper. My friend had left for a weekend trip, leaving a small project unfinished in the backyard, an old, wobbly fence that needed fixing. I wasn't particularly skilled with tools, but when she appeared in the doorway, wearing worn jeans and a casual blouse that hinted at effortless elegance, I felt a surge of nervous energy I couldn't explain. "Thought you could use an extra pair of hands," she said, her voice steady but light, almost teasing. There was a warmth in her tone that made the work feel less like labor and more like an invitation. She handed me a hammer, her fingers brushing mine briefly. The touch was brief, but it lingered in a way that made my pulse quicken, and I had to clear my throat to hide it. We started working side by side, measuring planks and tightening loose boards. Every so often, our hands would meet while passing tools. Each contact was innocent, fleeting, a brush of fingertips here, a hand guiding mine there. But in the quiet rhythm of hammering and laughter, it carried a subtle tension that neither of us acknowledged outright. I caught her glancing at me once, her eyes soft, almost assessing, and I felt a strange mix of pride and embarrassment. She noticed me noticing her, and I wondered if she was amused by it. The afternoon air was warm, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and sunlight that made her hair glimmer like strands of gold. I could hear birds in the distance, the distant hum of traffic, but all I was conscious of was the sound of her laughter when I fumbled with a stubborn nail. "Careful," she said, smiling. "I'd hate to see you hurt that strong pair of hands of yours." Her words lingered in my mind long after I placed the last plank. There was a lightness in our banter, teasing, friendly, but underneath it, I felt something more, a subtle recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were both aware of a quiet, growing connection. I noticed the way her posture relaxed when I offered to hold the plank steady, the way her gaze softened when she gave a small nod of approval. It was almost intoxicating, this mixture of casual intimacy and unspoken curiosity. At one point, I reached for a tool she had just set down, and our hands met again. This time, our fingers lingered a fraction longer. I felt a warmth spreading up my arm, a flutter in my chest, and a fleeting glance told me she felt it too. Neither of us said anything, but the pause between us spoke volumes. By the time the work was done, I realized that something subtle had shifted. It wasn't just the fence that had been mended. It was the space between us, small but charged, full of possibility. I left that afternoon with a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, replaying every glance, every touch, every soft laugh in my head. The simple act of working together had opened a door, and neither of us seemed in a hurry to close it. Even now, thinking back, I can still feel the faint brush of her fingers against mine, the warmth of her smile, and the quiet thrill of being noticed by someone so composed, confident, and effortlessly magnetic. That day, I realized this wasn't going to be just a casual friendship. Something more was quietly, irresistibly starting to grow. It started with a quiet evening. I had lingered at my friend's house longer than I probably should have, ostensibly helping with a leftover chore, but in truth, I was reluctant to leave. She appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and for a moment, she just watched me. There was a softness in her gaze. The contact was casual, almost accidental, but it sent a warmth rushing through me that was impossible to ignore. "Do you ever feel like people expect too much from you?" she asked, her tone light, but tinged with something fragile, almost hesitant. She didn't look at me directly. Her eyes focused on the fading sunlight across the lawn. I realized she was sharing something small but personal, trusting me with a glimpse of her inner world. I shifted slightly, careful not to appear awkward, and found myself listening more intently than I had intended. Sometimes, I said softly, not knowing exactly why I was answering, but I think it's easier when someone notices the little things you actually do. She turned her head then, just enough to catch my gaze, and there was a pause, electric in its quietness. Her eyes met mine, lingering, thoughtful. There was something unspoken in that glance, a subtle recognition that maybe for this moment, the world and its rules didn't matter. My heart thudded painfully, a mixture of excitement, admiration, and a hesitant awareness of the gap between us. Age, life experience, everything, but none of it felt heavy. We talked then about small things, memories of my friend's childhood, a recipe she loved, a book she had read recently. But every word carried a weight beyond its meaning, a soft intimacy that seemed to settle around us like the cool evening air. I noticed the curve of her hand as she rested it lightly on her knee, the faint scent of her perfume, the subtle warmth that radiated when our legs brushed. I became painfully aware of her presence, of the way my own awareness of her made ordinary actions feel extraordinary. By the time I finally left that night, I was walking home with a strange mixture of exhilaration and uncertainty. Something was shifting, something delicate and fragile between us, an unspoken pull that neither of us named aloud, but both recognized. For the first time, I realized that this connection wasn't just curiosity or admiration. It was something quietly, persistently real. That evening left me restless, thinking of the fleeting touches, the soft laughter, and the vulnerability she had shared. It was the first time I understood that slow-burn attraction isn't loud. It's subtle, built in glances, in whispered confidences, in the shared warmth of a quiet moment. And I wanted more. It started as a joke, really. I had come over that afternoon to help with another small task, this time moving boxes from the garage into the shed. She was already there, standing with her arms crossed, watching me struggle with a particularly heavy box. The sunlight streamed through the open garage door, highlighting the curve of her hair and the quiet confidence in her stance. "Need a hand?" she asked, stepping closer. Her voice was light, teasing, but there was an unmistakable spark in her eyes that made my stomach clench. I shook my head, grinning, though I knew I was pretending I could manage the weight alone. "Your hands really do look strong," she said, lifting an eyebrow. "Prove it." It was playful, but there was an edge to it that made my pulse spike. I set my grip on the box, aware of her presence behind me, and for a moment, the world outside the garage seemed to blur. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, but the warmth radiating from her proximity made it feel softer, almost intimate. As I lifted, our hands brushed when she offered guidance. Her fingertips grazed mine, light but electric, and I felt my pulse quicken. I caught a flicker of amusement in her eyes, and for a second, I imagined that she was as aware of the tension as I was. I tried not to stare, tried not to let the moment stretch too long, but the way her shoulders relaxed when I held the box steady and the soft curve of her smile made it impossible to act entirely composed. "Careful," she said, her voice softer now, almost conspiratorial. "I'd hate for someone with hands like yours to get hurt." The words made my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the quiet, intimate teasing. I wanted to respond with something witty, something that could match her playful confidence, but my mind went blank. We continued, the task simple yet charged with unspoken energy. Every time our hands met, whether passing a tool or steadying a box, there was a fleeting warmth that lingered far longer than it should. She laughed once when I stumbled, a low, melodic sound that made the air feel heavier, closer. I realized I was noticing every small detail, the brush of her hair against her neck, the way her jeans hinted at the curve of her hips, the quiet strength in her posture. At one point, she leaned over to adjust a box I had propped awkwardly, and our hands met again. This time, I didn't pull away. I felt the subtle steadiness of her touch, the unspoken reassurance beneath the playful challenge. My chest tightened, a mix of nervous excitement and admiration. The playful challenge had become something else entirely, a dance of proximity and awareness, of attraction simmering quietly under the surface. By the time the last box was moved, the garage felt transformed. It wasn't just a pile of clutter cleared away. It was a space charged with possibility. The teasing glances, the lingering touches, the quiet laughter, all hinted at something slowly building between us, something neither of us could name aloud but both could feel. And in that moment, I realized that playful challenges like this weren't just fun. They were the subtle language of desire, whispered in the brush of a hand, in a shared smile, in the quiet thrill of being noticed. That evening, the house felt different. The sun had dipped low, painting the walls in amber streaks, and the soft hum of the refrigerator blended with the occasional chirp of crickets outside. I had stayed longer than I meant to, ostensibly helping with some leftover dishes, but really because I couldn't bring myself to leave. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, a gentle smile on her lips, holding a mug of tea. "Sit," she said softly, gesturing toward the small dining table. The warmth of her presence filled the room, a quiet gravity that made me feel both at ease and slightly on edge. I obeyed, settling across from her, noticing how her hands cradled the mug, the soft scent of chamomile drifting between us. We started talking, initially about mundane things, my friend's latest mishap at school, her plans for the garden. But the conversation soon shifted to something more personal. She shared a small story about a time when she had felt overlooked, a moment of quiet vulnerability I hadn't expected. Her voice was steady but soft, her eyes glancing down at the tea before meeting mine in fleeting, honest moments. "I sometimes wonder if people see me at all," she admitted, almost in a whisper. "Or if they only see what I'm supposed to be." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her she was remarkable, that her strength and grace were impossible to ignore, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, I simply nodded, and in that silence, a connection formed. There was no teasing, no playful banter, just a quiet understanding, a shared space where both of us could be seen and felt. As we talked, our physical proximity became noticeable. She shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing mine as she reached for her mug. I felt the warmth of her presence radiate through me, subtle but undeniable. I became aware of every small detail, the gentle curve of her fingers, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the tea, the steady cadence of her voice. Each nuance made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if the world outside had dissolved entirely. I realized then that this wasn't just admiration or curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, a quiet pull, an awareness of the bond forming between us. I wanted to reach out, to let her know that her vulnerability was safe with me, but I hesitated, conscious of boundaries, conscious of the age gap, conscious of the delicate trust being built. When the conversation finally lulled, we lingered in a companionable silence, sipping our tea and listening to the soft evening sounds. Her eyes met mine once more, and in that look, I sensed the same recognition I felt, a shared awareness that something subtle, profound, and entirely human was growing between us. By the time I left, I walked home with a strange mix of warmth and restlessness, replaying her laughter, the tilt of her smile, the soft brush of her shoulder. That night, I understood for the first time that slow burn attraction wasn't a spark or a rush. It was the accumulation of quiet moments, of shared vulnerability, of being seen and understood. And with her, each moment felt like it mattered more than I could have imagined. It was one of those late afternoons when the light softened everything, giving the room a golden glow. I had gone over to help her with a small repair in the living room, a wobbly bookshelf that needed adjusting. Nothing complicated, just an excuse to be near her again. But the moment I stepped in, I could feel a shift in the air, subtle yet unmistakable. She was already kneeling by the shelf, fingers brushing against the wood as she examined the alignment. When she looked up, her eyes met mine, holding a quiet, steady gaze that sent a small thrill racing through my chest. There was no teasing this time, no playful challenge, just awareness, and in that, something charged, unspoken. "Careful," she said softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "That one's heavier than it looks." I moved closer to steady the shelf, our hands brushing as I adjusted my grip. The contact was brief, but electric in its subtlety. I could feel the warmth of her arm as it neared mine, and my heartbeat seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Neither of us spoke, and yet the silence was thick with meaning. Every glance, every touch, every shared breath seemed amplified. As we worked side by side, I became acutely aware of the small details I had noticed before but now felt overwhelming. The curve of her neck as she leaned forward, the gentle sway of her hair, the way her eyes softened when she caught me looking. I was conscious of every motion, every micro-expression, and every fleeting brush of her skin against mine. At one point, our hands met while adjusting a shelf support. This time, we didn't immediately pull away. I felt her subtle steadiness beneath my fingers, the warmth of her skin, the quiet intimacy of the moment. I wanted to say something, to break the tension with words, but no words felt right. The hesitation between us said everything. Her eyes flicked up to mine, holding a look that was both knowing and gentle. I realized she was aware of what I was feeling, just as I was aware of her. There was no rush, no pressure, just a shared acknowledgement that something delicate, potent, and entirely unspoken existed between us. I could sense her heartbeat in the rhythm of her movements, and for a moment, the room seemed suspended in a quiet bubble of mutual awareness. We straightened the last board together, and I stepped back, letting her adjust the final piece. Our hands lingered near each other, almost brushing, almost touching, a heartbeat away from a connection we both recognized but didn't force. The tension was palpable yet controlled, electric yet tender, like two magnets held close without snapping together. When I finally stepped away, there was a fleeting, shared smile, a silent acknowledgement of the moment, of the attraction simmering just beneath the surface. Neither of us spoke, but in that quiet hesitation, everything had shifted. The air between us was heavier, warmer, charged with possibility. Walking home that evening, I replayed every glance, every touch, every subtle sign of awareness. I understood now that attraction wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was the small, suspended moments, the shared hesitations, the quiet recognition that left your heart racing and your mind refusing to let go. That day, I felt it. Mutual awareness, undeniable, simmering, and utterly compelling. The next time I saw her, the late afternoon had settled into a calm, golden hour. I had come over to return a book I had borrowed, but the air between us already felt different, lighter, yet still charged with the quiet tension that had been building over weeks. She was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself, the familiar warmth of her presence filling the room. "Hey," she greeted me with that effortless smile, and I felt my chest tighten, a mix of nervousness and anticipation. She handed me a cup of tea, our fingers brushing as she did, and the contact lingered just a moment longer than necessary. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. I felt the warmth of her hand, the softness of her skin, and the unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. We decided to sit together on the porch, the fading sunlight casting long, soft shadows across the steps. The air was cool, scented faintly with flowers for the garden. I felt the comfort of her presence, the way she shifted slightly closer as we talked, our knees brushing occasionally. There was no rush, no expectation, just the quiet intimacy that had grown between us over time. Our conversation flowed naturally, from light banter about my friend's latest antics to reflections on small, personal moments we had shared. She laughed softly at something I said, and the sound wrapped around me like a warm blanket. At one point, our hands met, resting casually on the porch railing. I felt the gentle pressure of her fingers against mine, a connection that was both comforting and electrifying. "I really appreciate you," she said quietly, her gaze meeting mine. There was sincerity in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust and closeness that had grown. I smiled, unsure how to respond, realizing that words weren't necessary. The warmth between us said more than anything I could voice. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. We sat in companionable silence, feeling the subtle rhythm of each other's presence. Her shoulder brushed mine lightly, and I noticed the faint rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. It was a simple, quiet moment, but it carried the weight of everything we had shared: the laughter, the teasing, the shared confidences, the fleeting touches. As the evening drew to a close, she stood and stretched, brushing her hair behind her ear. Our hands met again in a natural gesture, fingers curling briefly around each other's before releasing. There was a lingering pause, a silent acknowledgement that this connection wasn't fleeting. It was steady, warm, and quietly insistent. When I left that night, walking home under the soft glow of streetlights, I carried with me a sense of fulfillment. The slow-burn tension that had drawn us together had reached a delicate, satisfying resolution. It wasn't a dramatic declaration or a grand gesture, but a quiet understanding. We had noticed each other, truly seen each other, and shared moments that would linger in memory. I knew there would be more afternoons, more conversations, more quiet touches, but for now, the unspoken bond between us felt complete. It was a connection built on trust, subtle intimacy, and mutual respect. And as I glanced back at the house, seeing her silhouette in the soft evening light, I realized that sometimes the most powerful romances were the ones that grew slowly, tenderly, and naturally, exactly like ours.